Hey, Dave here. Let's talk about some types of virtualization software. Previously, we showed VirtualBox, which is a nice program. It's free, but I want to show some others, VMware Workstation and also Hyper-V. So VMware Workstation, I use this a lot, and you can see I have a lot of virtual machines inside of here, and it works great for testing purposes for customers and also for training purposes whenever I'm doing webinars or that kind of thing, and just for learning purposes. So let's take a look at one of these. This is a Windows 10 virtual machine, and you can see we have basically a snapshot here. It's frozen in time, and that's the great thing about it. You can power down virtual machines, but you can also suspend them at a specific point wherever you're working at, and then resume them when you're ready. So this is suspended right now. Let's look at some of the details. I've associated 8 gigabytes of memory for this because Windows 10 is pretty powerful, especially when it runs as a virtual machine. Now, my hosting system is a Core i7 with 32 gigs of RAM. And so I can afford to give a little bit more memory and also more processors. One processor with one core is not really enough for something like Windows 10 Pro to run as a VM. So I have 6 here, and you can see I have 60 gigabytes for the hard disk space. Now, again, the beauty of virtual machines is they only use what they need, and it can go as high as 60 gigs, but it's not nearly that much right now. I think it's about a gig that's being used. The network connection is NAT, network address translation. So this virtual machine gets an IP on the internal network, which is decided on by VMware Workstation, and you can set that as well. And it also has a connection to the external world via NAT, so you get a little protection there and more information. So lots of stuff you can configure when you're working with a virtual machine. And what I want to do is I want to start this guy back up, but we're not going to be able to. There's going to be a little bit of a conflict, and let me show what I mean. Let's click on Resume this virtual machine, and it tells us VMware Workstation and Device Credential Guard are not compatible. So we can't run this VM until we fix this problem. What is the real problem? I enabled Hyper-V previously so I could show that in another video. And the two basically, quite often, virtualization software from different manufacturers don't play well. They don't want to coexist or cohabitate. So we're going to have to disable that. And on this system, I use VMware Workstation the most, so I was going to do that anyway. But I just wanted to show this because the troubleshooting section of the A+ doesn't really get into virtualization very much. And this is a sort of common error that you'll see. So I just wanted to show this, a little bit of troubleshooting for this. So this is a problem with a Windows service, but it's really Hyper-V based. And to fix that, we can do one of two things. We can disable this particular policy for the credential guard, or we could disable Hyper-V altogether, which is what I'm going to ultimately do. But to disable the policy, what we do is we'd go to our local group policy editor with a gpedit.msc. And if I haven't shown that before, you just go to your run prompt and do a gpedit.msc. That brings up the local group policy editor. And then we'd go to the computer configuration, administrative templates, system, and device guard. And then here's the policy. Turn on virtualization-based security, which is enabled right now. If we double-click that and bring up the policy, we'll see it is enabled. Now, in some cases, this might not be configured, and the only way to fix the problem is to disable Hyper-V altogether. In other cases, you'd have to disable it here. And you can see here it says virtualization-based security uses the Windows hypervisor to provide support for security services, and that means Hyper-V. So a little bit of a conflict between Hyper-V and VMware, and you can understand why that would happen quite often between two companies. So again, one of the things we could do is we could disable it here, apply it, and click OK. The other option is to disable Hyper-V altogether. And to do that, we'll bring up the run prompt again, go into the control panel. That's control, all control panel items, programs and features, and then go to turn Windows features on or off. And here we have Hyper-V. So I'm going to deselect that, click OK, and that's going to need to pull files out. It's going to need to turn things off, turn services off that Hyper-V controls, including things like things that connect with Windows Defender and Credential Guard and so on, and then we'll have to reboot. So I'm going to reboot the computer and be back in just a bit. Okay, I've restarted the system, and actually it was a double restart to get all the Hyper-V stuff uninstalled. And so we're back here now and started everything back up, and we've got VMware Workstation back up here. So we're back in the Windows 10 virtual machine that I've created. And so let's resume it now. And our troubleshooting techniques appear to have worked. And so again, you either have to shut down that Credential Guard or shut down Hyper-V altogether to make VMware Workstation work once again. And you'll get this kind of thing back and forth. You know, be ready for conflicts between these systems. Okay, and so here is Windows 10. I got other stuff running too, Windows Server 2016 and Windows 7 Ultimate and various versions of Linux and blah, blah, blah. So let's just take a look at one real quick. And we can maximize the screen for this. And we'll log in. All right. And here it is, Windows 10. And you can see my IP here. And this is the internal network, 192.168.4, that I've created within VMware. So we're using this, but we're utilizing NAT to get out through the computer's main network adapter. Now, if I go to my main system, this is my main system. And if we do an IP config for that, you'll see the main IPs I'm using to get out. They're on completely different networks. So network address translation is happening between the two of those. To create a new one, we just go to File, New Virtual Machine, or do it here. And actually, version 15 is out. Now, there's a cost involved with Workstation Pro, but 15 is out. I'll be upgrading to that once I'm done with this video series. But we'll go to Custom, and just go through this real quick. You could choose hardware compatibility with various different systems. For example, you could do it for just Workstation, or you could do it for an ESXi server, which, and you know, I'm building one of these, and we'll show more of that in other videos. But I'm just going to leave it as Workstation 14 right now. Click Next. We'll say we'll install it from a disk image. Now we've got a Windows 10 image here, so we'll just show that. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but look at all the different options of things that you could install. All right. We'll leave it as Windows 10. Click Next. And now you want to browse to where this guy's going to go. Now, by default, it wants to put it in a virtual machines folder in your C drive within your user profile. But I don't want that. I want to go down to my media folder, my media drive, I should say, because this is an M.2 drive. And then inside here, I have a VMware folder. And that's where all my VMware virtual machines are located. Better to keep these on something fast. Now, a regular solid state drive is fine. That's what the C drive is, but the faster the better. We'll make a new folder in here. We'll just call this test. Okay, and we'll bring that up. Click OK. That's going to be our location where this will be stored to. Click Next. Then it says, what type of firmware are you going to be using? Well, for older systems, if for some reason you wanted to install, say, Windows XP or an older version of Linux or DOS or who knows what, you'd select BIOS. But generally, you're going to select UEFI, and you may want to include Secure Boot as well. Click Next. Then we select the number of processors. Now, that could be 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, but that could really bog down the system. Generally, what I'll do is I'll select X amount of cores to use. And quite often what I'll do is I'll say, okay, what does this system actually have? This system has a hex core. It's a Core i7 with 6 cores. So I might choose to go at 6 or half that to 3. But you actually saw that I was using 6 on this other Windows 10 VM before. So I'll select that. It actually does run pretty well. Then you want to select how much memory you're going to use. Now, 2 GB, that might not be enough. And I've got 32 gig available on the physical system. So 8 gig is probably going to be good enough, 8,192 megabytes. Click Next for that. Then you have to select the networking connection. You can use bridged networking, but this can really be a security vulnerability because what happens here is this guest virtual machine has to get its own IP address on the local area network. Meaning here's my main network, 192.168.41. It would have to get an IP on that network directly. So this is like a direct connection to the LAN. And so there's no separation. And so that could be a security risk when we go directly to the external network. So generally, and the default is to use NAT. And it would get an IP on the IP network that Workstation has selected, 192.168.4. And you can change that again with the virtual switch, with the virtual networking section in this program. You can also use host-only networking, which means that the virtual machines within here can talk to each other, but they can't go out to the external network. Or if you have some really confidential stuff, you could select do not use a network connection at all. So I'm going to leave it as NAT, click Next. Then you can select how this is going to connect. The recommended virtual method is SAS as a SCSI controller. So we'll leave it as that. But you can change the disk type. Generally, SCSI is the one that's recommended because it's robust. And we'll create a new virtual disk for this. Now you can use a physical disk too to get direct access to the local hard drive. And in that way, it kind of acts like a type 1 hypervisor. Not that big of a deal, but it can be if you have an M.2 drive. But I've found that it works fairly well just doing it as a virtual disk. Okay, so we'll do that. And we'll leave it as the default 60 gig. Click Next. Okay. And that VMDK, the initial one, we have to specify where that's going to go. And because by default, that's going to put it into documents. We don't want that. We want it to be in the same place as our virtual machine. So VMware test, save, and next. And there's our details. So you want to make sure you go through this. You can customize the virtual hardware. There's lots you could do here. Very in-depth. We'll click Finish, and that'll create our new Windows 10 virtual machine. Now, there's nothing there yet. We would have to power it on and start that install from that ISO file, or we'd have to make use of a pre-made virtual machine file. That's the basics for that. And we can always edit these virtual machine settings. That's the beauty of this. You can edit. If it doesn't seem to be performing that well, you can increase the processor cores or the processors themselves or the amount of memory that it might need, or decrease it if you think you don't need that much and you're going to have a lot of virtual machines running here. We could change the type of network connection. And if we go to the advanced section, you can make additional changes here. You could throttle it and so on. So if you need to have a direct connection, you can change that here. Okay, but I'm going to cancel out, not going to make any changes. We can also go to edit and the virtual network editor. Okay, this is your virtual networking, and you can add additional networks if you wish. The default that we had here was 192.168.213, and that creates a separate virtual network adapter that we saw on this system, VM-Net1. There it is. On the actual physical system with the actual operating system. And then we have this one, which is network address translation, 192.168.4.0. And that's what I'm using for all the main VMs. But we could do more. We could change it. And we could create additional networks. You have to have administrative privileges to do so, but you can modify all that here. And that's kind of like configuring the virtual switch or switches in Hyper-V. It's the same type of thing. So there you go, a little bit of VMware Workstation. Got everything running here. Got Windows 10 running in here, Windows Server, Windows 7, Ubuntu, Kali Linux for testing, all kinds of good stuff.